Good afternoon and welcome to the Hibs Observer Friday briefing with myself, Liam Bryce, joined by Patrick McPartlin to discuss all the latest, and there has been a lot of latest at Easter Road over the past 24 hours plus. Sorry folks, we're obviously here slightly later than our advertised start time, but there's a wee bit of breaking news to take care of that we'll get to shortly. I'd imagine most of you joining us will already have a fair idea of what's happened over the past day or so. Rocky Bushiri, long-awaited signing a new contract, committing his future to Hibs for another 3 years. Josh Mulligan joining from Dundee on a 4-year contract. And then just in the past few minutes, Nathan Moriah-Welsh has left the club to join Mansfield Town on a permanent deal for an undisclosed fee. So, Patrick, a lot to digest. So let's maybe take it in order of confirmation, because the Josh Mulligan news broke a wee while before it was confirmed. But I think probably the big story anyway is, considering it's been running on for a wee while now, is Rocky Bushiri's future, committing himself to Hibs until 2028. I think it's kind of hard to understate how important that is, because I think I tweeted a wee bit about it last night, and that it's not just how individually good Rocky was from kind of November onwards last season, but how important he was to the success of Hibs' overall system. So it's a really good bit of business for the club to get that done, isn't it?
It is, and I think when you think back to what David Gray was saying about wanting to keep the core of the squad together after such a successful second half of the season, at least. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think when you look at how Rocky's improved, like on an individual basis, and also what he brings to the team, you look at that back three last season in the sort of 3-5-2. Once Hibs switched to that system, he just looks so comfortable in that kind of that central role with Jack Iredale on one side and Warren O'Hora or Lewis Miller on the other. And I think that, Lee Johnson said something when he was talking about Rocky a couple of years ago now, and he was saying about rating him at sort of £10 million, that sort of thing. We know that Johnson did come out with a bit of hyperbole at times, but you could kind of see what he was meaning, and that I think Rocky does have quite a high ceiling as a player, and it was just probably the fact that he hadn't played as many games as you might expect for someone of his age when he came to Hibs. And I think Rocky spoke about that himself. Talking about needing trust from managers to kind of really kick on. And I think that's what he's had, especially under David Gray, but it shouldn't be underestimated that, the start of last season, he was very much not a starter. He was, a bench figure. We didn't see him all that often. And, so he came back in from the cold to become a really key player. And I think, it's keeping a settled defence is hugely crucial, to building on last season. We've heard plenty from the players. We've heard plenty from David Gray about what Rocky brings to the dressing room, as well as what he brings on the pitch. And I think it's probably the case that a good sort of like 5 or 6 months for Hibs is something for Rocky to build on. And we know there's been interest from other clubs. We know there's been interest from teams in England and overseas, and like for Belgium, and I think there was interest in January from Egypt as well. So I think it's probably one of those situations where you think if he can kick on at Hibs, then the sort of the world's his oyster pretty much. He is still, I think, 25, probably relatively young in centre back terms, still got a good few years ahead of him. And I think Hibs is probably the best place for him at the moment to be developing and to continue to keep progressing. We know that he works really hard to try and improve himself, and we saw that firsthand last season. And I don't think there's anything to suggest that he won't do the same again this time.
Yeah, he really seems to have come into his own. Just kind of really fits in that system. As I said earlier on, it was not just individually excellent, but a real kind of core reason why it worked so well collectively. And just a guy who seems to be really kind of enjoying his football as well. So it's probably come down. We know he had other options. He was kind of obviously well within his rights to take his time and consider those options. But I think, for what Hibs have been able to, give him the platform to do, he's over the past year. David obviously works so well with David Gray. He's become such an important figure in the dressing room. And I think just, from a recruitment perspective, would have been a difficult man to replace. He's kind of the attributes. I know it's kind of well publicised that there's been high profile errors and stuff in the past, but I feel like he's kind of for large parts of last season sort of cut that out of his game. He's a lot steadier. And just a kind of all-round big player for Hibs. So I mean, to get that done and over the line is a it's a bit of a coup for Hibs, really, because as I said, it would have been a hard man to replace. Somebody who could step into that back three with all the attributes that Rocky brings to it, the sort of cohesion that they built between, obviously with Iredale on the left of them last season, and then a kind of rotation at times between Warren O'Hora and Lewis Miller. Something to keep that together is massive, and I think especially with those European games coming up and not so long, obviously less than a month to go until that now, to then maybe have to look for another centre back, bed them in, and then that would have been their first competitive game coming up, because there's just so many really positives, I think, to keeping Rocky around the place. So to move on, just a wee bit, shortly after, there was a confirmation this morning, of Josh Mulligan coming in from Dundee, a really versatile player, Scotland under-21 international, only 22, but he's already made 124 appearances for Dundee. He was with them, from the age of 8. He spent time on loan with the likes of Cove Rangers and Peterhead. So, I mean, a kind of experienced player for somebody of that age. Can play in centre midfield, can also play out sort of right back, right wing back. I think last season, and from what I could see generally, if Dundee, they kind of flip-flop between formations at times. If they're playing a back four, he would generally form part of the midfield three, maybe out towards the right of that. If they went to a back three, as Hibs played for the majority of last season, he's able to step out and play at right wing back. So it's a signing that seems to make a lot of sense. One of the kind of the brightest young Scottish players in the Premiership last season, without a doubt. We know there was interest from Rangers. I believe there's probably interest from down south as well. So for him to be able to get that one done, it's on paper looks like a really good acquisition. That I think
it does, yeah. And I think a lot of people quite impressed that had managed to keep that as quiet as they did. I think it only really came to the fore in the last couple of days. And I think a lot of people just kind of assumed he was either heading to Rangers or he was going to go elsewhere. But I think I saw a few people saying that even in the most recent game between Hibs and Dundee, which was a comprehensive victory for Hibs, Mulligan stood out for them. And I think that's a fair comment. I think he's one of those players who catches the eye no matter what his team's doing. And I think that again, like I said about Rocky, it's a player with a really high ceiling. And it feels a little bit like Hibs are going back to the kind of successful recruitment policy from seasons past, where they would look to other teams in Scotland. I mean, John McGinn is the obvious one that sort of jumps out and just sort of say, well, you come at Hibs and we'll give you a platform to go even further. You could argue that that was probably the way they kind of sold the move to Kevin Nisbet as well when he came in from Dunfermline. They've done it with countless players over the years, and it's served them well in the past. And I think there's if you can say to a player like, you're going to get regular games, you're going to be playing, you're going to get a chance to play in Europe, you're going to get noticed because you're playing for Hibs, not to take anything away from Dundee, but again, for like international football as well, that's a big thing that Hibs focus on is you play for Hibs and you play well, then you are more likely to get international recognition. And I think that there's been a lot of debate about whether he's coming in to play central midfield, whether he's coming in to play right wing back or whatever. I think you consider that Hibs are very well stocked in central midfield areas, to the extent that Nathan Moriah-Welsh has moved on this afternoon for regular game time. Still keen to bring Nectar Triantis back in some capacity, and when you consider who else is there, having Mulligan able to play there is a benefit, obviously. But I would be very surprised if he wasn't sort of earmarked as kind of competing for that right wing back berth with Chris Cadden. What I think is really interesting is you take Jordan Abita and Nicky Cadden from last season, the amount of times that David Gray would explain that it was good to have one of them to start the game and play 65, 70 minutes, and then the other one to come on for the final 20. Because as we were told many times by Gray last season, it's not about the starting 11 and subs. It's about kind of starting players and finishing players. with sort of 5 subs able to be made in games, I think that sort of changes how managers approach games. And there'll be some games where certain players are suited from the start, and other games where there may be better options coming off the bench. And I think when you consider who Hibs have in the squad who can play in certain positions, I think for that right wing back role in that 3-5-2, you've only really got Chris Cadden and Lewis Miller, and latterly we start to see Lewis Miller playing as a right-sided centre back. So assuming that that's going to be continue this season, with Miller being seen more as a centre back rather than a right wing back, that to me would seem to suggest that Mulligan has been brought in primarily to go for that right wing back role. But we know how much Gray likes to be flexible. We know he likes his players to be able to play in more than one position. I don't think it's sort of the dumb thing to refer to them as utility players anymore, but I think that's ultimately what you're getting. Just this, a player can obviously play in central midfield. They can play right wing back, right back. I think some people said even played up front for, forget if it was Cove Rangers or Peterhead, but clearly a player who can play in several different positions, which is, we know that's what David Gray likes, but also his character and what he brings to the dressing room. Hibs have been so big on that. I think probably since Malcolm Mackay came in, it's been a big feature. Is are they the right kind of the right kind of characters for the dressing room? What will they bring? How they conduct themselves. And you look at the previous business with like Jack Iredale coming in. You look at Warren O'Hora. Even bringing Nectar Triantis back. You look at bringing in Nicky Cadden. All people who have contributed on the pitch, but I think off the pitch as well, their influence has been clear to see. And it looks like Mulligan is another one that ticks an awful lot of boxes for Hibs. And I think it'll be interesting to see how he sort of like kicks on, because he was very impressive figure for Dundee last season. And as I was saying, Hibs can give him a platform to kind of kick on and improve even further.
Yeah. Really intriguing signing that, as you say. Dundee were keen to keep him. There was interest. Rangers sniffing about clubs in England, and he's again at only 22. He's a player with a lot of development still in the tank. Sort of just been kind of, obviously we saw him last season and the game at Easter Road. I believe we got a comment here saying that he also got man of the match in that horrible foggy night at Dens Park that we probably shouldn't talk about too much. So he's been impressive against Hibs, and they've obviously taken note of that. And with him going out of contract, they've moved pretty quickly to take that opportunity. It's just, having watched him, he seems like a really good carrier of the ball, a really strong runner, powerful runner. If you've had a chance to check out the profile piece that we've done on him on the website, you can see there kind of numerous examples of him, carrying the ball large distances up the pitch, whether that's in from the sort of right wing back area or through the middle of the pitch. 5 assists for Dundee last season as well, which was joint most alongside Lyle Cameron. Which was pretty impressive for a guy playing, flitting between different positions. It shows that he can be effective and he can be creative in either role. I think kind of spoke about him a few times as being like a strong runner, a good ball carrier. I don't want to do him a disservice in terms of how good an actual footballer he is. Some of his underlying numbers, as you'll see in the piece as well, just because 5 assists could have been more. He's got good numbers in terms of chance creation, because obviously once the ball gets to the player in front of goal, you're relying on them to put it away as to whether you get an assist or not. So it doesn't tell always the full story of how creative a player is. But Mulligan, some of his numbers from last season, as I said, we've looked at, are pretty impressive underneath that. So Hibs clearly getting a really good player there. A player who's still to come into his prime, a young Scottish player as well. I know it's that cliche in Scottish football, but knows the league, knows what's expected. But there is truth to that, and it's one of those that think that you can't see really any negatives in Hibs doing that one for probably a relatively small outlay as well. Just moving on again, because we've got loads to cover. In fact, before we go on to Nathan Moriah-Welsh, actually, there was a comment I wanted to come back to. It was just clarifying here. Hi guys, do you think Mulligan coming in means Nectar doesn't, or is Mulligan coming to compete with Chris Cadden? I think you sort of touched on that, Patrick. It's not a case of Hibs have went and signed Josh Mulligan because there's no deal now to be done for Nectar Triantis. we've certainly not heard anything to suggest that those two, that's related, so it's like it's kind of independent of each other. Still interest in Nectar Triantis, and just because Josh Mulligan's come in doesn't mean that there's not still a deal to be done there.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that Hibs will be looking to improve the team in any way they can. There will be occasionally players will become available who you didn't think were going to become available. Obviously, the opposite happens as well. There's moves that you might think are on, and then they're for whatever reason fall through. But I mean, I think can't for the life of me remember who it was. This is terrible. I'm having a complete memory block. Simons, player who went to Bolton, who was linked with Hibs. I mean, that wasn't a sort of an either or for Triantis. That was very much a very much just looking to bring as many players in as possible to kind of strengthen the squad. And I think that's that when you're at this stage when you're trying to build on last season, I think Hibs will be so aware of having to sort of juggle European football with the league campaign. They know what happened the last time they tried to do that. Just as a reminder, Hibs lost their opening 3 league matches, whilst doing okay in Europe after a sort of brief embarrassment in Andorra. Came back to beat Interclub de Scaldes and then defeated Luzerne of Switzerland in the next round. And then after that, I forget what happened. I think Aston Villa might have been involved, but
somebody might be.
All joking aside, yeah, I think Hibs will be sort of wary of both Hearts and Aberdeen looking to improve on their seasons last season, and building as well. Dundee United can't be discounted. I don't think St Mirren could be discounted as well. I mean, you look at the some of the players that Hearts and Aberdeen and Hibs are bringing in. I think it's quite clear that there is going to be an almighty battle for third place at least next season. It's going to be an interesting campaign, but I think from Hibs' point of view, it's about if there's a player who will make the team better, then they will and they're available. If a deal can be done, then they will explore it. So as I was saying, I think Mulligan looks awfully like an option at right wing back. If you look at how many, I mean, you obviously need a bigger squad if you're going to be competing in Europe and the league. If you look at the left wing back role, you've got Jordan Abita, you've got Nicky Cadden. If you look at the right wing back role, if we assume that Lewis Miller is now a centre back rather than a right wing back, then Mulligan and Chris Cadden sort of fulfilling that role on the right side looks to be the most obvious thing for me. I mean, the fact he can cover in central midfield is another option. It's that flexibility, that versatility that Gray likes from his players. But no, I think Hibs still very much keen to bring Nectar Triantis back in some capacity or another, whether that's a permanent deal, whether it's a loan. I think we saw how important and how influential he was last season. We know, I think we know that he has big ambitions, but it's all about how much game time can he get? Is he going to be one of the main men? And I think we look at him pulling out of the Australian camp at the end of last month to kind of focus on his future at club level, and I think that probably indicates just kind of how big a decision it is for him to make. So I think an interesting one to keep an eye on, but I don't for a moment think Mulligan's a Triantis replacement at all. I mean, very different types of players as well. So I think worth keeping an eye on the Triantis links, because I don't think that one's going away anytime soon.
No, absolutely not. So yeah, Nathan Moriah-Welsh has departed Hibs to join Mansfield Town, as we said at the top of the show. Hibs getting a fee for an undisclosed fee for him. It only made, I think it was only 4 starts in the league he made last season. 3 of those came in the same week. What a week it was, mind you. Hibs beating Celtic, Dundee United and Hearts. And Moriah-Welsh started in all 3 of those, if I'm remembering correctly. Did really well in those 3 games, but I think over the season he was used pretty sparingly. I think I'm pretty sure there was times maybe in the first few months of the season where he wasn't even making the 18 on a match day. Was kind of a bit more involved, maybe off the bench and stuff towards the latter stages. But I think maybe one kind of looking at it with the midfield options, Alassane Amani coming in, the pursuit of Triantis, Mulligan coming in, Jamie McGrath, or different types of player. It was maybe not so surprising that Moriah-Welsh has moved on, because it was sort of difficult to see a place for him in the starting 11, and even really the match day squad heading into next season. But I mean, somebody who's going to go, I think, with the best wishes of kind of everybody at the club. The statement that Hibs put out sort of wrote some really kind of positive words about him from David Gray and Malky Mackay. But it's one that I think, Patrick, seems to make sense for everybody.
Yeah, and I think when he first came in from Bournemouth under Nick Montgomery, he was one of those January signings. Certainly brought a bit of dig to the midfield, a bit of drive that had been missing, which I think is probably a pretty damning indictment on what the middle of the park had looked like prior to his arrival. And I think, you mentioned that sort of three game week where he started. He actually started the first game last season, that 3-0 defeat at St Mirren.
Oh yeah.
And then sort of I think was kind of bombed out of the starting lineup along with several others. Which I think was just David Gray kind of recognised that some things had to change. And I think a big thing last season was like the togetherness of the squad, and how even players who weren't playing were still sort of putting in maximum effort in training. They were still they were training hard, they were working hard to try and get into the team, or if they were going to come off the bench, they wanted to be able to give a good account of themselves. Dylan Levitt's an obvious one there. Martin Boyle as well, and he sort of had his sort of like underwhelming start to the campaign, which he then kind of I think did all right when he came back from that spell on the subs bench. And quite a few players who maybe weren't kind of, Rocky Bushiri is another one, players who maybe weren't in the reckoning to begin with, who knuckled down, and every time they were called upon, they didn't let the team down. And I think Moriah-Welsh was a bit like that. Gray spoke about him, like the way he celebrated the Boxing Day derby win at Tynecastle, the fact that he came in for those 3 games, huge week, 3 wins out of 3, 9 points, played a big part in that. And I think it's from what David Gray was saying about Moriah-Welsh, it's very much not being able to offer him the game time that he wants. And I think a lot of managers would say, if a player wants to be playing more football, that's probably a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't get that at the current club, then it makes sense to try and find a solution that benefits everyone, as you were saying. And I think you could see that Moriah-Welsh certainly brought something to the team. I mentioned that sort of that drive and that dig when he first came into the team. But I think when you look at the starting midfielders last year, for the most part, Triantis, Levitt, first half of the season, Newell, it was difficult to see him kind of displacing one of them. And I think there probably was a place for him at the club previously, and I think he's maybe been a bit of a victim of the way that David Gray wants to play and how he wants his midfielders to play. And I think a player who probably would have been happy to have in the squad, but couldn't guarantee that he'd be in the squad every week, couldn't guarantee that he'd be playing every week. And I think it probably makes sense for the player at the age he is. I think 23. Yeah. He wants to be playing regular games at this time of his career. He'll maybe feel because he was at Bournemouth, he had that loan spell at Newport County, and then he came to Hibs, and I think was fairly regular to begin with, and then, as you say, kind of fell out of favour a little bit. I think 40 appearances for Hibs in all competitions, which isn't the worst return given that he didn't play as much as he would have liked. But going somewhere like Mansfield, I think you'll probably be guaranteed regular games. It's a league he knows well from his time at Newport as well. So I think it makes sense. It clears the decks of players who maybe aren't going to play that much, and means that you've not got the risk of players who are kind of kicking their heels on the bench and maybe bringing the overall mood down. But yeah, I do think it was interesting how Gray did sort of highlight him several times, including when I spoke to him at the end of the season for that kind of look back on the season as a whole. He was talking about Moriah-Welsh and talking about how they kind of managed him, and how they felt that when he did come back at the team, it was like he'd not been away from it. And he was saying that was a real credit to Moriah-Welsh, and it was also indicative of how they wanted the team to be, how they wanted the squad to be on a kind of daily basis. And yeah, I think we saw that from Moriah-Welsh. We saw it from a lot of players, but these things, nothing lasts forever. So I think it probably makes sense for all parties that he moves on.
Yeah, it was something that was spoke about quite a lot last season about guys who were, coming in from the cold and making an impact when they were asked to. And I think Moriah-Welsh was probably the epitome of that. But he moves on to Mansfield to try and re-establish himself as a first-team player. Just before we go, we're kind of aware of reports coming out of Portugal that Jair Tavares is to leave Hibs by mutual consent. I believe that's coming from Record in Portugal, which I think is one of the biggest sports media outlets over there. Again, wouldn't be a surprise. On loan at Motherwell last season, had that brief renaissance under Nick Montgomery, but then kind of fell away after that. Went to Motherwell. I don't know exactly how many appearances he made for Motherwell, but I do know that it wasn't very many. And again, he was always one who was, I think, would have been coming back to Easter Road with a view to sorting out his next move. And again, these reports from Portugal, it's not been confirmed 100% as yet, but it does look as though he's going to be on the move. And again, that's not much of a surprise, is it?
No, I think I think it's possibly been taken a little bit further forward by Record than actually is. I think it's certainly something that would make sense again for all parties. When you consider the way that Hibs play, I don't really see Jair fitting into that. He is sort of like an out-and-out winger. I know Motherwell sort of tried him at wing back on occasion, but I'm not really sure that was a resounding success. But I think, as you say, there was that brief renaissance under Nick Montgomery, but I think it just hasn't really worked out for him. I don't think he was helped by the kind of big sort of welcome or the big sort of build-up he was given when he did come in. I think that probably piled the pressure on him from the off. But again, something that you want players to be happy. You want them to be, you want them to be playing football as much as possible. And if they're not getting that at your club, then it sort of makes sense that you look to try and find a solution. And I think, it wouldn't be. I don't think it would be a huge surprise, as you say. Obviously, sources in Portugal may well have a bit more insight into whatever's happening, given his time in the Benfica academy. But yeah, I think that again another one to keep an eye on. But as I understand it, it's a little bit premature. To suggest it's all like done and dusted. But David Gray was saying. Just saying this morning, in fact, when he was speaking to Sky Sports, saying there probably will be outgoings. So, we've seen Nathan Moriah-Welsh leave, talk of Jair leaving as well. And I think there's, there could well be further outgoings depending on, who the club are able to bring in. If, if players feel they need to move on, that sort of thing. So, we're not even in July yet, and the transfer window has been, certainly very, very active for him so far. And I don't think that'll change anytime soon. So, we shall try and keep abreast of all the rumours and all the done deals, links, you name it. Always fun.
Yeah. But for just now, we are going to leave it there, folks. I think we've managed to cover just about everything that's been happening over the last few days. A busy few days, and it's only going to continue that way. Hibs going on there. They're due to go on a pre-season training camp over in the Netherlands next week. We'll be there. Patrick will be there representing the Hibs Observer on the continent. So we're going to bring you...
An awful lot of pressure to put on me.
An awful lot of pressure. It's because I know you can handle it, that's why. So we're going to be bringing you as kind of thorough coverage of that as we possibly can. So do keep an eye on the website. We'll be plenty here on the YouTube channel. So if you've not subscribed to the channel yet, do give that subscribe button. Do hit that for us, folks. It means you'll get a notification every time we bring you. It's going to be very regular videos from the training camp next week. There'll be plenty of coverage on the website as well. It's currently £1 for 6 months to sign up to the Hibs Observer. You'll get full coverage on there as well. So everything to do with the training camp next week. Hopefully more transfer news to come out of that, but there'll be interviews, analysis, everything in between. So yeah, do keep an eye out for that and do consider subscribing to the Hibs Observer if you haven't already. But I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, folks. We hope you have a good weekend, and we'll speak to you again at the start of next week. Cheers.